After Vladimir Putin warned that mooted US plans to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles represented a whole new level of escalation, Donald Trump rather dialed down the rhetoric this week, saying he would only deliver the long-range weapons if he knew what Ukraine planned to do with them. But further diplomatic engagement with Moscow seems unlikely for now after the Russian Foreign Ministry's assessment that any momentum gained at August's Alaska summit had been largely exhausted. Meanwhile, as Germany became the latest NATO member to report hostile drone sightings in its airspace, President Zelensky accused Russia of using its so-called shadow fleet to launch reconnaissance operations. And with legislation being drafted across the continent to allow security forces to destroy drones, is Europe preparing for escalation too? You've been in touch with plenty of questions, and as always, our team is here to answer them.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm James Waterhouse.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Well, as I mentioned, Vladimir Putin was pretty vocal in his opposition to the US providing Tomahawks to Ukraine. So let's hear our first question this week.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Ian from London. Firstly, what proxy wars are Russia currently involved in? Secondly, what possible responses could Russia have to the US supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, let's start with the second part of that question, if we may. What is likely to be Russia's response? Because we did, of course, this week hear President Putin give a long speech, one of the ones he likes to do, in this forum called the Valdai Forum. Perhaps, tell us a little bit about that forum, first of all.
It's a meeting of experts. Some of them I'm tempted to call experts in quote marks, but basically people aligned with the Kremlin's point of view, understandably. And Vladimir Putin attends that forum every single time. And this time he spoke for about 4 hours, covered a lot of areas, and some of the things he said were predictable, some less so. When it comes to the Tomahawks, he said that if America supplies those missiles, that would be the end of relationships with America, at least the hope that they're getting better. Now, why did he say that? Tomahawks are a formidable weapon. The range is 2,500 kilometers, which would put Moscow well within range of possible Ukrainian strikes. But Vladimir Putin said, well, that doesn't really matter. We'll deal with that. To answer Ian's question specifically, I think Russia's likely response will be to do nothing. And nothing is what Russia did after the West supplied Ukraine with main battle tanks, long-range missiles, F-16 fighter jets, despite Russian warnings. Essentially, Russia wants Ukraine to be exposed and less able to respond to Russian attacks.
James, what's your view, the discussion around the Tomahawks? Where do you think the Ukrainians see this?
I think Ukraine is trying to take matters into its own hands. I think, Vitaly's right to point to recent history as to what the Russian response might be, but the West doesn't see it like that, does it? It's still petrified of an escalation in some form, and if you look at what Vladimir Putin was saying, he's certainly playing to that. But with Ukraine, they are short of cash and short of the means to manufacture the weapons they want. That said, there are some breakthroughs. We've talked about the Flamingo missile, for example. We've talked about their drone production. Ukraine will want to, as I say, take matters into their own hands, strike deep inside Russia. We're seeing the impact of them targeting oil refineries. Olga, we were mentioning about, Russian supply routes being hit with their reliance on rail. This is something Ukraine has become pretty good at, and it's seen a return in terms of hampering Russia's ability. But there is quite a gap to be bridged when you see the continued lack of commitment from Donald Trump on their very supply and the Kremlin looking to play to those Western fears.
We'll come back to some of the points you've raised there in subsequent questions, James, but I just wanted to touch on that first part of Ian's question about proxy wars. I suppose, Olga, that the very term proxy war is a bit contentious, isn't it?
It is. And I prefer to speak about like hybrid warfare, and it comes in many forms. And I think when it comes to, obviously we know that some of the Russian mercenaries are like in Africa, and there are literally boots on the ground that are involved in taking part in various conflicts. But I think it's also very important to make a point about influence operations and information warfare, because Russia uses and invests a lot in is what they see as soft power, into propaganda machine, into spreading disinformation. And they use a whole kind of bunch of, diplomatic accounts that spread disinformation in conjunction with like media outlets. They promote Russia's image in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and kind of present Russia as a benevolent force. So it's like to me, the information side of it is actually very, very significant.
I think it's important to mention that despite waging this hugely expensive and exhausting war against Ukraine, Russia is still involved in places like Africa, which means that this isn't just about Ukraine. Russia is really keen to expand, what it calls its influence or its presence all over the world. And some people like to see it as Russia waging war against a lot of countries, the West maybe, NATO.
Of course, Vitaly, Russia talks about the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between it and NATO.
It is a slightly loaded term, you're right. The Kremlin has been saying for a long time that the West is waging war against Russia and Ukraine is but a tool, a tiny ram. I think that's the word that Putin used at one point, a battering ram used by the West against Russia. That's Russia's point of view. We have heard, of course, Western politicians saying that Russia is waging a war against them as well, a hybrid war, a direct war. But what they mean is slightly different. They're saying that Russia is attacking not just Ukraine, but Europe as well. And Europe is having to help Ukraine. And also, by doing that, it's helping itself defend against Russian attacks.
We are feeding in, though, aren't we? As Russia is trying to frame this as a proxy war, it's Ukraine being invaded and it's Ukraine defending itself. And I think that is the difference here. Yes, the Western help and intervention, not least in those early weeks of 2022, have been significant over time, but we're not seeing a level of intervention like we've seen in wars previous.
Yeah, well, let's turn to intervention that is happening in NATO, European airspace, because this issue won't go away, and that is the response from NATO to these apparent Russian drone incursions, which continue to be reported. And Nick has been in touch about that.
Hello, Ukrainecast. My name is Nick from Hampshire, but currently working in Central Europe. What's the point of a drone wall on the eastern flank if the threat comes from inside the EU country, rather like Ukraine did in Op Spiderweb in Russia? The drone wall on the eastern flank would be rather like the Maginot Line of old, don't you think?
I'll talk about the wall perhaps with you, James, in a sec, but just perhaps we ought to remind listeners who don't follow every twist and turn what Operation Spiderweb actually was.
So the Operation Spiderweb was is effectively an intelligence operation planned by Ukraine when they smuggled drones into Russian territory and then launched them from inside Russia, quite far away from the border in some cases, and successfully hit some of the military like airfields and some of the targets inside Russia. And it was planned for quite a while. And obviously the people involved in it in some cases were like unwitting drivers who had no idea what was going on.
Thanks, Olga. James, let's turn to this concept of the drone wall. The comparison with the Maginot Line, which of course was a physical wall of brick and stone that was built on the eastern flank. It's not really like that, is it?
It's not that, Jamie. I mean, the Iron Wall, when announced by Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, had big sort of Iron Dome energy, didn't it? Referencing Israel's effective air defence system. what she wants for the European Union is radar systems and some kind of interception weaponry that would take out Russian drones when they continue to violate European airspace. All sounds well and good. The Baltic states on Europe's eastern flank were all for it. They said, look, now's the time for Europe to pull together. But those further from Russia's aggression, like France, like Italy, have said, well, hang on, is this the best use of money? It requires all of our consensus with this. Nevertheless, it has been passed. We are going to see something brought in, some kind of heightened defence. But as you say, it's not going to be this sort of heavy fortification on the borders of Estonia or Latvia. It's going to be much more porous than that because, as Emmanuel Macron of France pointed out, we're talking about a border more than 3,000 kilometres long. But there is another problem here that Europe needs to think about is, for Russia, these drones, certainly these decoy drones that were intercepted over Poland, they cost a few $10,000, right? They were intercepted with jets costing billions.
Cost effective.
It's got to be cost effective. They've got to. It's a strange sort of aerial battle of economics as well.
Well, lots of interest in drones. Nick, thanks for that question. And we've got a slightly, different take on it now. It comes from Tim.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Tim from Copenhagen. I'm wondering if Ukrainian intelligence, not Russia, might be behind the drone incursions in Europe. A friend in the Danish military implied to me that's being investigated. With Munich now on the list, it seems more likely they're being launched from land, not from the sea, which would explain why the German and Danish governments have trouble identifying their origin and seem reluctant to blame Russia directly. Is Ukraine pulling a Nord Stream on land?
Well, perhaps the context of that question, first of all. Pulling a Nord Stream on land, Vitaly, what's he referring to?
He is referring to attacks that destroyed gas pipelines built and majority owned by the Russian gas giant Gazprom, supplying Russian gas to Europe. And there have been arrests of Ukrainian nationals suspected of carrying out those explosions. Now, I would see what's going on in terms of costs versus benefits. Well, the benefits of disrupting Russian gas supplies to Europe are obvious, and the costs are reasonably low to Ukraine. There's a difference between targeting a Russia-built and Russia-majority-owned pipeline and essentially attacking European transport infrastructure. Presumably, what Tim's friend is implying is that Ukraine could possibly stage something like this in the hope of provoking Europe into helping Ukraine more. Now, that is the potential benefit. The cost...
What are called false flag attacks, in other words.
The cost, if Ukraine were to be found out, would be devastating for Ukraine, given how heavily it relies on assistance from those European countries. Who would want to continue helping Ukraine if it sends drones to European airports? And also, no less importantly, would it work, given the huge reluctance we've seen on the part of those European allies of Ukraine to take drastic action to respond to all sorts of hybrid Russian attacks?
And there has been a reluctance, hasn't there, Olga, that of some countries, and many of these countries, to actually directly point the finger at Russia over these drones.
Well, the main problem with these supposed drone attacks or drone sightings is that we don't forensically, from like open source and from visuals, we don't really have much evidence either way to suggest what the origin of these drones it really is. My team spent days looking at really grainy footage from Denmark, trying to identify what drones we're seeing, where they might be coming from, and we didn't get anywhere. And we did it time and time again. We've had speculation quite early on social media, and then repeated by officials including in Ukraine, that oil tankers in the Shadow Fleet may have been used to launch the drones. Plausible because there were oil tankers in various areas around Scandinavian countries, but that is not necessarily hard evidence in itself. There's no visuals of them launching anything. We know that the Danish police hasn't ruled out the possibility that at least one tanker has been involved in launching drones, but we don't know what kind of intelligence. We don't know the details of the intelligence that countries like Ukraine and the Danish police are like dealing with.
When it comes to NATO and particularly the EU, the pace of decision making is often something that's criticised. That's partly, of course, because there are many different countries with competing priorities, and one of the most often characterised as an antagonist is Viktor Orbán, the leader of Hungary, his country. And Leah in Lincoln has a question about that. She asks, please, can you tell me what NATO and the EU can do to persuade Hungary to support any future measures both would wish to implement to support Ukraine against Russia? If Hungary will not conform to the views of the majority, what can both organisations do about that? Don't know who wants to take that on, Vitaly?
Cost and benefits again. I think one measure that could work, and I think has been attempted unsuccessfully, is withholding the benefits the likes of Hungary are getting from the EU, which are numerous. But the fact is that this is how the EU is set up. It is governed by consensus. So if one member objects to a decision, well, it is very difficult to pass. So this is what it is, and so far, both the EU and NATO have been unable to change their minds. There's Orbán and there's also Viktor in Slovakia, and possibly Babiš in Czechia may join them.
Yes, well, that's the development over the last week as well. Those election results in Czechia, the Czech Republic, and a new government still being formed, James, which seems to be more Moscow friendly.
Absolutely, and I think if you look at Robert Fico recently visiting the Kremlin, I mean that tells you enough in itself. The growing reach, if you like, for Russia going into European politics, and it does, as Vitaly was saying, have an effect. It slows military aid packages for Ukraine or stops them completely. I mean, Viktor Orbán in the past has turned a blind eye when it's come to the NATO accessions of Finland and Sweden. But if you're Ukraine, not just the EU, you're reliant on consensus. And when that consensus is being tested, not least by right-wing populist governments emerging in Europe, but also the ambivalence of Donald Trump, it's very hard for Ukraine to sort of to place any confidence in the support it's receiving.
Well, look, I mean, we can just play it. It's this interesting little interaction that took place at the European summit in Copenhagen between Viktor Orbán and the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. They both go up to the microphone and Viktor Orbán's asked a question.
Who's the main threat against Europe right now?
Provocation.
No, it's the real question. Please, Prime Minister.
So the real danger, economic stagnation and losing competitiveness. This is the danger.
Not Russia?
Sorry. Not Russia? No, we are stronger than... So, okay, guys. So we are stronger than Russia. Make some comparison and base your opinion on the facts. So we have more than 400 million people, yeah? Russia is 130-something. Look at the European GDP. It's like that. Russia is like that. We spend altogether 27 more on military spending than the Russians. So why we are afraid? We are stronger than they are. The question is whether we have...
I love him when he used my argument
whether we have leadership to come together and to defend our interests together. That's what we should do. Anyway,
You just heard Donald Tusk there just popping up and saying, you're using my arguments.
The passive-aggressive hug.
Yeah, it was interesting, isn't it, to hear the arguments that are used by Viktor Orbán. Look, we shouldn't be worried about Russia. We're stronger than them.
And I think Donald Tusk probably saw an irony in that, because if indeed Mr. Orbán believed that in Europe's collective might in slowing Russia's war machine, then he might have been a bit more enthusiastic on European sanctions packages and military support for Ukraine, one might argue. But it was these summits can be dull on occasion, but it's there's the occasion, as you know, Jamie, you get these they bubble over in the form of a forearm grip in front of the cameras and a bit of passive aggression smothered on top.
Yeah, indeed. Well, look, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. We're going to turn to what's happening on the ground, actually, now. We've been talking about the air a lot during this edition, but Doug from Leicester has messaged in and has this. I was wondering whether the Ukrainian government had considered using troops from non-NATO countries to reinforce their own forces on their homeland. Russia couldn't complain, as it has already used North Korean troops. A question there about Ukraine actually using foreign troops, Vitaly. Has it thought about it, do you think?
I'm sure it has, but it's a question of finding a country willing to send its people and then possibly facing Russian retaliation, open or hybrid, on its own without the protection of NATO's Article 5. And NATO member states are, well, I'm generalizing here, but they are generally better equipped and better protected. So this country outside of NATO will likely be more exposed to Russian attacks. So if NATO member states have been so unwilling to directly engage with Russia, what hope is there for Ukraine to find somebody outside of NATO who would say, well, yeah, I'm going to send my people to Ukraine?
But also equally, even with volunteers that are engaged from various countries that are engaged on the ground.
We should mention that,
yeah. There are plenty on the ground. Even with that, every single time there is some video of a volunteer in Ukraine, Russian media will pick it up and say, well, we are fighting with NATO troops. We are fighting with more than just Ukraine. And they always seize on it.
And I mean, all the way along, of course, there's been this red line, hasn't there, from Russia, that if there is official NATO deployment, that would be a serious escalation.
And you'll keep hearing the Kremlin say that. I mean, what NATO would say to that is, well, it's if Ukraine wants our support and we decide to collectively, then that's up to us. I don't think, and it has been ruled out, we're going to see NATO boots on the ground. It's still unlikely. Talk of how a ceasefire might be policed is a distraction. But what has been a constant for Ukraine is the fact that it is Ukrainian volunteers, elite soldiers, some foreign volunteers, as you say, who have been doing the fighting. And you come across these guys, but they are doing it in Ukrainian uniforms.
What about on the other side? Because the North Korean troops, that's well known. But it's interesting that the Americans are now saying they think that up to 5,000 Cubans are fighting for Russia. I know there was talk earlier on of maybe a couple of hundred, but the Americans are sort of using that as a way of actually lobbying against Cuba at the United Nations.
Yeah, I did an article for the BBC a few months ago about how Cubans are being lured to Russia, and it's usually promises of extremely high payments by Cuban standards, as well as Russian passports. North Koreans, 15,000 North Koreans apparently been sent to help Russian forces. So Russia isn't really that afraid to escalate and involve others. And that, of course, helps Russia and is a huge obstacle for Ukraine because its allies are really keen to appear, at least, as uninvolved directly in this war.
Thanks for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. But in the meantime, why not search for Ukrainecast wherever you get your BBC podcast? You'll get plenty more analysis there. But for now, thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.